Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Today is a Comprehensivist Wednesday that we do in collaboration with the Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society, which has lots of thinking members in there. So today we are focused on Louis Sullivan's idea of form follows function. And we're trying to do something quite ambitious. We're going to start with a bunch of people who are familiar with Louis Sullivan's idea of form follows function. And they're going to talk about how they see this idea of form follows function as being a comprehensivist principle. It is a principle that can be applied to any field, across fields. Once we have had multiple people talk about it, we're going to have, currently the plan is to have Maritza, Brian, Evanique, David, Joe, and Shrikant talk about it. And then we're going to go into breakout rooms. Each breakout room will have multiple people who are familiar with Louis Sullivan. So we get to have a conversation there, after which we come back and you ask all the questions you have about form follows function. I want to tell you right in the beginning, the word form and word function has been used in so many different ways by so many different people, many times to have exactly opposite meaning of each other. So here we are talking not about the words form or function. We're talking about the concepts of form and function that Louis Sullivan used. So try to get that, because that's what we are trying to talk about. Okay, so we're going to start with Maritza. Maritza, go ahead. What do you see? Can you describe what form follows function means? Maritza was one of the panelists in the two series that we did on Louis Sullivan, one on autobiography of an idea and one on kindergarten chats. She was the newbie. She was the person who had not been studying this for 20 years. And it was amazing, her comments. So I'm glad to have her go first. First talk about what form follows function means and answer the question, how do you see it as a comprehensivist principle? Please take your time. Go ahead, Marisa.
Okay, so I'm actually going to start you guys off with reading a little bit from early on in the kindergarten chats. It's in, I forget what chapter, but it's early on. It's like somewhere between 6 and 11. And in kindergarten chats, Louis Sullivan is actually kind of teaching a young architect about what really one should know about to be an architect. And he has a section on values. And I want to start with that because that's part of how I'm going to get to answering how I view form follows function. So, he tells us that, all real values are subjective. And, the young architect is telling him that he has values. So Louis Sullivan goes on this almost tirade, and it's beautiful. He says, "Oh, you have value, have you? What is your value outside of your bank account? Who values you and why? What are you good for when you are sifted down and your externals removed? What is your worth? What have you ever done? What can you do? Who are you? What are you? Why are you on earth? Are these questions fair or are they not? Are they in order or are they not? Are they practical or are they not? Are they social or are they not? Are they democratic or are they not?" So that's the end of what I'm reading there. And I go back to this section whenever I try to ponder form follows function, because I really, truly believe that when he was saying function, he didn't mean the literal definition function. I also don't think he meant it in the more superficial concept of functionality. Just, I would say when Louis Sullivan was using the word function, he meant life essence. And to me, these questions are boiling us down to having to look at our life essence. So that's what I see there. That's what I got out of it. I do want to say that for me, it was a transformative experience to read Sullivan, especially I got the pleasure and benefit of reading it in a group setting and with people who had been studying it for like 20 something years. It was absolutely life-changing. And I do find that it touches so many things. So there's another, to follow this concept of looking at it from the idea of essence, right? So when he says that, he actually says the essence of a thing in nature is its life force. So if the life force results in the outward form of a thing, well, then that's what he's meaning when he's saying the function, the form is following the function because the function comes first. I recently have been reading some opposing views to form follows function, but I will say that I read them, I hear them, I find them to not dislodge me of this view that it is life essence. I am convinced that people who may have issue with it are perhaps not viewing it in this grander scheme picture of, of the life essence concept. The idea that integration is key, that's the component that jumps us from Louis Sullivan and his philosophy, looking at it from a view of architects, jumping to anything in life. If we are looking, we have all been walking forward and trying to pick up the mantle of believing that we are designing animals, that we can walk forward with intention and that we can make intentional choices to design our lives as opposed to allowing our lives, the chips, to land where they are. If we look, if that is the case, then the way to do it is through this integration that Louis Sullivan is proposing to us. The idea that things should be neither superfluous nor too bare is also something that he talks about. And Sullivan speaks quite a bit on the need for remembering nature. And what I get from him also is he also speaks a lot about the need to remember that we stand upon the shoulders of our ancestors. Now that's my phraseology, right? It's just the way I like the way that sounds. But he does tell us that nature weeds and winds its way through everything. Anything that we consider, if we consider it in a bubble, it's already separated from what would make it the strongest. And that's what I'm hearing him say to us. I mean, he speaks of values, he speaks of characters. And I love, he tells us that character is not confined to the individual. And he talks that it defines everything, your state, your nation, and it trends towards the minutest of things. And I really like that because, so these are almost like catch phrases and words that we hear every day, and maybe we don't really stop long enough to consider what do they mean. They're like values, character. They're kind of thrown about. Sullivan is saying to us, they all sit along a similar axis. They are tools that we must wield as we move forward. And that brings us to, my current favorite word, intention, right? We're coming back to that. It's this matter of, if one haphazardly sketches out the design for a building, things are going to be missed. It may not be necessary. It may not have all the components necessary to suit the needs of the building. So how do we extrapolate that and look at it from a perspective of a non-engineer? If you haphazardly walk your path in life, you may find yourself looking up one day and wondering where the heck you are and how the heck you got there. Because there was no intention and there was just floating and perhaps even evading. And Sullivan talks about the dangers of just doing what is what has always been done. And the reason being because there's no thinking there. If there's no thinking, there's no intention. And I like the concept that if we look at it from, so I don't always say form follows function, but I really think that it kind of sits on the back of so many of the concepts that we've been discussing. Well, first, it's actually form ever follows function, right? And the idea there is that it reminds you that it's never just one thing. One cannot just ever have a form. The beauty of that is that conversely, one cannot just ever have a function. There is a push and pull there that we see across many of the platforms that we look at. For example, at one of our comprehensivist discussions, we've talked about the pathways inside our brain and how they work and how you stretch them, and as you learn and you grow, you make new connections, and the reach back capabilities become stronger with different things we practice. And it seems like you would never consider Sullivan when thinking about neurology, but I could see that there. And there's also, I know that there's a lot of controversy over different evolutionary paths and whether or not, form truly follows function within some organisms. But in general, that is something that we can see in nature as well. And applying it to our lives, nature doesn't have to be just trees and plants. If you think nature, you think just more grand picture. And it brings to mind the idea of the environments, right? And so if we remember that we do not exist in a bubble, everything you touch might touch you back. And that's something that we were just talking about even in the design way here. And it's the idea of a culture is something that is pervasive in everything that Sullivan writes. And it's just beautiful. And the idea of the necessity for us to embrace all those things that came before. Even if you don't know what they are, just acknowledging that we benefit today from those things that those who came before us did helps. Now, you also don't want to get into any dogmatic ideas because that's taking it too far, right? So now if we just only ever look at that and we're like, the ancestors did it this way, so I'm going to keep doing it exactly this way, that's dangerous also because, again, you've gotten away from thinking. If you're not looking at things and considering them from various different perspectives, well, then how can you confirm that you're attempting to ensure that your form is following your function of whatever it is you're considering? If you're not considering it, if you have blinders on and you're just saying, I'm going to take what this person did and push out these carbon copies because that's the way it's been done for 50 years. You've divorced yourself from the process of making, of thinking. And I really think that that's something that Sullivan shines a spotlight on for me. And I see it just throughout all of the various topics that we've talked about. In my attempts at comprehensivity, what I find most helpful when considering specifically the idea of form follows function or form ever follows function, I
think Maritza is having some problems with her internet, and we will continue with Evanique. And then when Maritza comes back, she can finish her thought. Evanique, how do you see form follows function as useful in thinking about a wide range of problems?
So for me, I got introduced to Louis Sullivan and form follows function with the Meetup on autobiography of, I can't talk today. I think it's Autobiography of an Architect, right?
Autobiography of an Idea.
Idea, yeah. I don't know why I just blanked on that. But what I got from form follows function is that you have to take the function in mind when you're doing something. And I think Maritza talked about it with intention, so I'm not going to go too much into it there. And she's coming back, so I'm going to stop for a minute and then let her finish her thought.
Okay, let's see if she's back. Maritza, would you like to continue?
Sorry about that. Apologies.
No problem.
That won't happen again. I just switched networks. Right. I've lost my thought process here. I guess I'm just gonna think, or I guess one last thing I'm gonna say really quickly is the idea that I think it's useful to remember that it says also the idea of, a right start and a right finish. And the idea here is that, this is a philosophy. It's a way of life. It should also not be a dogmatic principle. And that, I think that's something that we're seeing as we dissect things within this comprehensivity group. Everything, that's the key to everything. The answer is don't hold so tightly to any idea that you don't have room for seeing how it interweaves with other things, for viewing it differently, and maybe finding pieces that fit better. And so you hold on to this component, but maybe not another one. And I'm going to end it there. Thank you, Shrikant.
Thank you, Maritza. So folks, what we are doing here is that we're going to have multiple people talk about what they understand by this idea. It's a very simple idea. And what we are saying is that it's a general principle, universal principle that can be applied across fields. So that's a very bold claim. It's a very large claim. So please take it, deliberately. The way we are approaching it is we are going to have multiple people talk about what they have gotten from the idea. Different people, their level of familiarity with the idea differs. So you will have some kind of a picture. Then you will have an ability to discuss it with the same people who've been talking about it in a small group of about 6 or 7 to 8 people. Then you come back, keep track. I strongly always recommend pen and paper to keep track of all your questions, all your observations. You'll have an opportunity of putting all your questions down. And then everybody, including each of you, get to answer those questions, okay? So we're trying to really dive deeply into this idea by doing this crowdsourcing. Next up is Evanik, followed by Joe, David, Brian, and Shrikant. Evanik.
Yeah, so I got introduced to Louis Sullivan by reading Autobiography of an Idea and reading it with the Saturday group with people who were already familiar with Louis Sullivan. So I was very lucky. And so today what I want to talk about 2 things is work, well, 3 actually, work, education, and religion and spirituality. So with education, what I found fascinating is that Louis Sullivan was considered slow when he was young. And, it wasn't that he was slow, it's that he was bored. And I think I found it fascinating that he picked his own teachers. He picked people that he admired and he wanted to learn from. And he picked teachers that he knew could benefit him educationally. And I found that fascinating because I think a lot of times with the way we do school in the United States is that we don't really allow kids to figure out what they're good at or figure out what they're interested in. We just tell them, you should know this. And we sit them all in the class and we teach them all at the same time, at the same speed. And I like that Louis Sullivan kind of took his own path in terms of not only what he was going to learn, but how he was going to learn it. And you could see it throughout his life when he chose to go to Paris and learn there and get into school there. Then he decided that he was going to learn by experience, going to Philadelphia, Chicago, and other places. Like, he was an adventurer. And I think that fits with form follows function, because his function was to learn, and to learn particularly how to be an architect so that he could design his own buildings and create his own things and make his mark on the world. And what I loved about it is that he didn't care what other people thought. He really just wanted to do what he wanted to do, and he went out and he did it. The second thing I want to talk about is in terms of work. There's a scene, there's a place in the book, Autobiography of an Idea, where Louis Sullivan is watching the street sweepers, and he's watching the beauty of that work. And, most people don't think of work as beautiful, but he just saw it as like the most fascinating thing in the world. That these street sweepers, and then he was looking at people clearing the snow and all these things. And he took that, right? And he took that beauty in the work, and he took the form work and he made it follow the function, which was his architecture. He was a very hard worker. Um, and again, he worked at learning what he needed to learn to get into the school in Paris. He took the work that he had to do and didn't falter at all with it. He knew what he had to do and he did it. And there was a beauty in that because he wanted to learn from this school in Paris. So I just saw the beauty of it. And the way you can apply it to life is that, we can look at work and being like, this is something that we have to do, and we just get through it. Or what I learned from Louis Sullivan is that I can learn to love the work, the idea of work, and knowing that that work is going to allow me to pursue the other things that I want to pursue, because I won't have to worry about money because I can work, and what the beauty of work is, and a blessing. And, and I know that sounds strange, but, when you have to work, you probably could find the beauty in it. And I think it makes the work better. And you go out there and you do your best. And so I love that like, work for me is to function. Well, work for me is to form, and the function is to enjoy my life and explore new things. So that's how I use it that way. And finally, I wanted to talk about it in terms of religion. Um, we have studied form follows function in terms of the Gita, the Bible, and the Tao Te Ching. And I really see it in the Bible, that when we've been studying the Gospel of John, and, Jesus is the function, like Jesus is the goal, to be with him and to have him inside of you, in a sense, and have that spirituality inside of you. And the form, I think, is, getting to know him better and really looking for him and seeking him. And with the Gita, which I'm less familiar with, the thing I love about the Gita is they talk about work in one of the yogas. And the thing about work is that you do work not for the result. You do work, not, I don't know how to say it, but you do the work not attached to the results. You do the work for the beauty of doing the work. And you're doing the best because you want to work from the center into the periphery, and not the other way around, not from the world or the periphery into the center. So when you're working from the center, you're working in a sense for the divine in you, and the divine in your soul. So you're working for that. And I think that's really what captures the beauty of work. If you're working for a certain result, like a promotion or a raise or whatever, you may not get that. You're depending on externals. But if you're working for the sake that I have to feed myself, I have to clothe myself. If you're working from the center and it's fulfilling that purpose, then it doesn't become such a chore, I guess. And So that's what I got out of form follows function, and that you can find the beauty in the form. And even though you're going for the function, you can really find the beauty in it. And that's what I took from my limited experience of Louis Sullivan.
Wonderful. Evanik, that was wonderful. So I'm just going to comment quickly on this. One point that Maritza made about dogma. Maritza is warning against dogma. To put it in form follows function, dogma is simply when functions get coagulated into forms and you become really focused on forms or rituals or ways of doing things, when they lose their actual meaning for what they came, that you actually produce them for. So all of rituals are of that kind. Evanik talked about education. When Ruth Bernstein, who is one of the leading researchers on comprehensivism and polymathy, he was complaining that the way in which science is taught is that people are given the results of science and saying, okay, these are the formulas, these are the laws, remember them. And while giving them the results of science, at the same time, you're destroying the ability of doing science, which is about asking questions, about curiosity, about using your mind to make observations and put them together. You are getting the forms, which are the results of the function, but you're destroying the function in the process, which is not a good strategy for education. Evanik talked about the religious context, and the center and the periphery is a beautiful way of capturing the function and the form. The center, or spirit, if you will, is what is your purpose? What is the highest thing you're going after? Holding on to that is the function. And it is expressed through various actions, through various things we make. And those are the forms. And the forms follow from the function and support the function. So there is this loop between form and function. And you can see that even in our reading of the Bible, or any of these works, most people get hung up on the, what we have again and again, many people have pointed out, is that freshly looking at the text, you can discover their function, original function, which is lost when people convert them into rituals. So fantastic observations. Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe. And what I will do is that I will make quick comments on everything everybody says to kind of keep adding to it. By the way, I'm a big fan of Louis Sullivan. I have to tell you that when I first discovered Louis Sullivan, it was through kindergarten chats. I bought 35 copies of the book and gave it to anybody whom I thought was good at all. And I found something very stunning, that 1/3 of the people came back saying, wow, this changed my life. Thank you so much. 1/3 of the people said, oh, it's interesting. And 1/3 of the people is, what is this? Why did you give me this? What does this mean? Okay. And I was so amazed by this variation in reaction that I rewrote the whole book. I took the book, I reworded things, cleared. It took me a year to do that, and and published it on my blog. That's what I did. So it's that important to me. And the reason, so I want to point out very quickly about why is it that people don't get it? Because in modern times, modern thinking is materialistic and analytical. It's thinks of everything in terms of billiard ball things. So the idea of function, which is about the final causes, is not focused on, or the concepts such as will, spirit, purpose is not something that is easily integratable in modern way of thinking. So that's why people find it difficult. All right, next up is going to be Joe.
Yeah, I mean, so I wasn't ready to maybe speak on this, but it has been a general principle that has impacted me on a number of different levels. And what happens is, if the more you can start to look at the world as in this context, form follows function, your eyes start to open up. And so an example would be, when are people holding on to the forms? And what is the result of that? And I see that in many places that I've consulted for in the past, where that their jobs are going to change. The function of what they did was no longer useful. And people would hang on to the function of their job. And they would go kicking and screaming. They didn't want it to change. Or they were hanging on to the form, I'm sorry, not the function. They were hanging on to the form of their job and not the function. And what they realized in that, or what people were missing in that process, is that they were actually hurting themselves. They may be hurting the company they'd be working for. They may be hurting the clients that they serve. And once you have an idea that you're now looking at this from a different perspective, you're starting to see, well, maybe that's me as well. What forms am I hanging on to in my life? One of the great quotes that has stuck with me during one of our meetups was by Karl Popper, where he says, the ability to allow our thoughts to die is what enables us to live. And that's very similar to what your ability to allow things to die that are no longer serving the function that they once actually had served. And this can be as true to, as far as when you were talking about consulting for a company and saying that all these people have to change and adapt to new ways and new ways of working. But this also happens as much as in our social lives as well. You know, what am I hanging on to that may no longer be serving me? Who may I be hanging on to that may no longer be serving me? And there you get to some really deep questions. And you start to really understand, if you start to look at the world like that, you start to say, why did this institution exist in the first place? What purpose was it serving? And is it still serving that purpose? You can apply that to religion. You can apply that to every, civic institutions. You can apply that to, and as I just mentioned, relationships. So when you start to see the world as a general principle, you start to appreciate. And that's another thing that Louis Sullivan really does well. He appreciates, and Evanik alluded to this, he appreciates the efforts of the people that are working. You know, he has an appreciation what it takes to build this building. He appreciates all the things that go into, all the efforts and all the thing, everything that it takes to bring something from a concept to the real. And I think that you really have this deep understanding of why you're doing something in the first place, why it exists in the first place. And when you can start to ask those questions, you're asking very deep questions. And then you can start to move forward yourself and challenge yourself, as well as look around and see what changes do I need to make, and what changes do maybe a company or anything else may, as I mentioned, need to make. So I think that as a general principle, that it really allows you to ask better questions, because you're searching as to why something exists in the first place. And then you just go through these very deep philosophical questions. And then you gain an appreciation of what it took to maybe build an institution. And you get an appreciation as to why the forms existed into the first place. You get this historical knowledge. A lot of people, I feel like sometimes they come in, and this is where something with the design way I would talk about, is you come in with a boilerplate way of doing things. You have an answer, right? You're coming into an organization. I know how it needs to be designed, and this is how everybody else does it, and this is how. And it may not apply, because you have to really think about what's the organization trying to achieve, and what are the dynamics, what are the historical, what's the historical context. Once you understand those things, you really start to see, okay, this is what they're trying to treat, this is the nuances of the business, and this is how the new form may need to look, if there even needs to be a new form. What was the first rule in Beyond Order? It was don't denigrate institutions, or something. I know I could. Don't denigrate institutions and or creativity. And the reason you don't denigrate the institutions, sometimes when you come in, you think you have all the answers. That's why you don't denigrate them, because you actually have to understand why they exist in the first place. And then that's where you can decide where the changes need to be made. So as a general principle, you can look at yourself and say, what changes do I need to make? Or you can look externally, what changes does an institution need to make? And then this gets to something that Maritza had talked about, was the idea, then you can kind of start to form intention. And that's a really important part of the whole process. Once you ask those questions, you can start to be intentional about what you're actually trying to do. It also gets to the other point that Maritza had been making about dogma. That if you're dogmatic, then you hold on to the forms that exist, as opposed to letting them go. And I think that, and Ebony kind of took my one example where the hierarchy in the Bible series that we were looking at, it's a beautiful example, is where the hierarchy, the institutions themselves, were trying to, people were hanging on to the institutions themselves, the leaders of that time. And you have Christ here saying, these institutions are no longer serving what their purpose was. And he's looking at the functions of it. And the other people are looking at the forms. And I think so you start to see this where it starts to exist, and it exists in everyday life. So I think that this is, it's one of the main principles that I can say that I've taken from 52 Living Ideas that has changed my entire perspective on the world. The other thing that I've appreciated, and Srikant, you've done this, is your ability to apply it very quickly allows you to have a much better conversation. It really does. You're able to apply the principle very quickly. And I realized that by watching it. So when I take a step back and I start to think to myself, what's the points that you make sometimes? You make them very, you're quick and you're understanding what somebody's trying to say, and you understand, okay, what they're saying, and does it serve the function? Is it beneficial to everybody involved? You're able to adjust and apply that principle very quickly. And the quicker that you can apply it, the better that you can maybe, or more meaning, you can engage with people in a more meaningful way. And I realize it's a hard principle to apply very quickly. That's, what my experience is that I can apply it a day later when I'm looking at this and I'm thinking to myself, what was the point of that? Or what was the function? What was I even saying in certain cases when I'm looking at myself or someone else? But, then the more you start to understand this principle, the better you are at reacting in a more meaningful way. So, that's pretty much it.
Wonderful. Joe, that was beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. So I want to comment on 4 points. First one is the point that you made about comfort. See, what happens is that forms are there. So, functions are these alive things that require a lot of effort. You're deliberately doing something intentionally, and you're working very hard to make things. Forms are the results of these. They're there in material forms, in things. They're there in your habits. They're there in the emotions. They're there in the social interactions that you have. They're there, just there. They are part of your system one. They are there outside of you. They require less effort. That's one reason people stick to the forms because being alive to the function all the time means taking the responsibility of saying, what are my intentions? What is the most important thing in this context? And be able to reintegrate that. Holding on to forms doesn't require taking the responsibility of doing that. Secondly, they are comfortable. Holding on to forms is comfortable because you are used to them already. So you don't have to do anything. It's all nice and comfortable. But it is the comfort at the price of going away from what your function is. What is it that is really important and meaningful to you? So those are the reasons why people hold on to the forms even when they are no longer serving the function. So that was point number one. The second point that you made, which was excellent, was the point about history of it. Each form has a history. There was actually some function that created it. Even if that function is no longer operative, that function created it. So one of the things Louis Sullivan says is that no one has actually more respect for these great architectures of the past because it was a genuine achievement of creating those forms. It's that what you have to respect is the functions that created those forms. If you grab onto the forms and try to apply it somewhere else mindlessly, you're actually going to kill functions. You're not going to create functions. So to understand history of the forms, and it also connects with the point that you made from the beyond order. So all the systems that you're looking at, all the forms you're looking at, you cannot denigrate them. You have to understand why they are the way they are. And you have to understand both the stability that the forms give you and the creativity that is needed to keep updating it. And you have to be able to make the choice. But in order to make the choice, you have to be able to say I. You have to be able to say, what is my purpose? What is my intention? Go back to this first principle of function in order to evaluate the form. The third point I want to talk about is that of application, fast application. You think I applied fast? No, it's not true. The thing is, the only thing that I have found is that I have found this principle to be useful at any time. So at any time, I can always ask the question, what is the function here? And is what I'm doing or what we are doing, is that following the function? And stunningly for me, every time I ask it, I am able to figure out something new about what is going on. And that's the power of this function for me, that no matter what it is, whether I'm familiar with it, whether I'm unfamiliar with it, when I'm familiar with it, actually I find that, oh, I have been lazy in going, just going with this thing. Why is it going? At the same time, many times you discover that, oh, you know what? This form that I'm using is actually the right form because it is doing that. So you're kind of, sometimes you validate the form saying yes to it. Sometimes you say no to it. Many times you find that you don't have the form. The other thing to realize is that this form and function is like yin yang, that you are going back and forth between. It's not saying that forms are bad. No, you need forms in order to express the function. But you have to keep this thing alive by having this continuous going back and forth. So beautiful, beautiful points. Just amazing. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is David. David is new to our meetup. He's from Philadelphia. He studied Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright. So David, what can you talk a little bit about form follows function and how you see it applicable? Go ahead.
Yes. I approached Sullivan as an architecture student. Um, I walked into architecture by way of Frank Lloyd Wright. I loved his writing. But then I grew to love Sullivan and Mies van der Rohe. I see them all sitting at the same table. To me, form follows function means that if it works, it's beautiful. It becomes beautiful. If everything to which is dedicated is harmonious, it plays a beautiful song of function, but the form becomes beautiful itself. Let's take the example, let's say, the Alhambra. It's in Granada in Spain. And the architect who designed that had a problem. One of the major problems is the summer. In mid-July, it averages between 110 and 115 degrees. So that problem has to be dealt with. How do you create a comfortable space? What forms will create this beautiful function? Or what functions will create this beautiful form? Maybe the first step is to build on the north side of the hill to minimize the effect of the sun load. Well, okay, fine. That makes a terraced environment, which can be very pleasant because you can have a great diversity of spaces. That becomes attractive. They did something very unique I've never seen in any other building. Because of the terracing, that created the need for banisters. And the function of the banisters, of course, was to keep people from falling and ensure their safety going up and down the stairs. But then there was the heat problem. And so, as they say, Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. They had a water source at the top of the hill. And they fed that water into the banisters. They created these little kind of streams down the tops of the banisters. And the water would flow from the top to the bottom of the hill. And it would cool the entire environment like an air conditioner. And so it became a very pleasant space, a beautiful space, a palace, one of the 7 wonders of the world. You must go there. I mean, it is the most beautiful place. If you take your girlfriend there and have a picnic and make love in the garden, you'll never forget it for the rest of your life, guaranteed. You know, the Alhambra will inspire a beautiful melody inside your head. You know, it's not like music, it's like emotions. When I say a melody, I mean, for me, music is something that creates an experience, you know, and this peaceful and beautiful experience, and that can be done with words. It can also be done with space and the experience of being in a place like the Alhambra. So there, what was needed, you needed protection from the sun, you needed a cool place, you needed a shady place. Well, okay, that can be done just by doing what was needed. And that became beautiful. You know, then they added like tiles and all kinds of embellishments, decorations, okay. But the basic idea was there. I want to give the example of the Roberto Clemente School in Philadelphia. I participated with many other people in the discussions of how that would take shape. And we had to look at the goals. And the goals weren't to control heat and, you know, 110 degrees, because we have air conditioning now. Remember, Alhambra was there before air conditioning, so they had to deal with it somehow. So air conditioning was a problem. We wanted to build community, because the school is all about community. And children will learn more if they feel they're in a safe place and in a place where everyone is cooperating. And so how do you do that? Let's look at Hadrian's villa. Hadrian was a Roman soldier who had a villa in Rome, like way back when, I don't know, 200 AD or whatever. Historically, he created a really pleasing house for himself. It was in the shape of a square, except the entire center was a courtyard. And within the courtyard, he'd have tables and he'd have like trees for shade and a fountain to provide cooling air in Rome. And we all looked at that and thought like, wow, this is great. This is a place to build community because it pulls people together like that. We did that in Brooklyn. We took down all the fences. The landlady said, what kind of fences should I put up? I said, don't put up any fences. Give the people a chance to come together. And in that backyard, it's not big, it was a half acre. But we built a very beautiful community of people who would gather on a regular basis, like almost daily, you know, and cook together and bring musical instruments. And so the space created the harmony, created the opportunity for the harmony. And so the Roberto Clemente School, we wanted to have a large community space in the middle. And so given the site that we had, didn't have to be square, it was more like a triangular site. And we built like a large space in the middle where we had an amphitheater, which they could use for outdoor assemblies and for performances. That was very important to us. And trees were fine. And the great thing about having an outdoor space, especially if the form allows people to see it from the outside, is that it becomes a safe space. We talked to a lot of the parents with their baby carriages, and they wouldn't go in unless they could see the street because they were afraid of being isolated, you know, in this environment and being victims. So of course, we selected the name. A great philanthropist, Roberto Clemente, you might know of him. He died in an airplane crash. He was flying some food into Panama. They had had an earthquake. He's also a famous baseball player. So his statue is there as part of community building. And the American Institute of Architects decided this was a great school. And they gave us first prize for best new school in 1998. First prize in 1998. So we were very proud. And how did we come to that design? We were thinking about how do we pull people together? You know, we've got to get them into that middle space. We've got to give them activities like an outdoor theater, for example, or an outdoor auditorium, and a place that would draw the community in. We want the mothers to come in there with their baby carriages. We want enough space for them, for the kids to play games in large yard and functionally, you know, to be safe and also observable and contained. Form follows function. Yeah, the functions of that school designed it for us. We did not set up a rectangle with floors going up. No. We didn't do that. The human element was the most important thing. How do we pull our people together and keep them and give them an opportunity to do something for each other?
Wonderful.
Form follows function, yes. For example, why was Chicago 2 stories high in 1900? Why? Because they didn't have the technology to go up. So they had wooden houses, and they would insulate them with newspapers that they would soak in whale oil. And so when the Chicago fire went up, it went up like a match. And that got people thinking, we can't have this anymore. Next thing they did was they invented the brick cavity wall. With the invention of the brick cavity wall, it became possible to build up to 5 stories high. And so buildings started to go up. And so we have Brooklyn, where everything is 5 stories high. You can pack a lot of people in there. It's the densest population in the world. It's more dense than Bangladesh. It's like 25,000 people per square mile. It's like unfathomable. And what did Sullivan do? Reinforced concrete came along. You can do amazing things with reinforced concrete. It's incredibly strong, much stronger than normal concrete. You just take those metal rods and run them through, and all of a sudden you have something that can deal with earthquakes and all kinds of other impediments. And so he built things up. And so who's next? Well, his student, Mies van der Rohe. Of course, let's build a Seagram building on 53rd Street in Manhattan, which was like so far ahead of his time, and made it possible to have this kind of beehive of people in Manhattan that we have today. I don't know a lot. I heard the comments that you made, Maritza and Angelique, and Joe. You're a lot smarter than me, and David, I want to acknowledge that.
David, that was just incredible. David, that was just incredible. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm going to comment very briefly. My friend Rupali is here. Hi, Rupali. If you can talk, just go ahead and type. Hi. I'm going to make some comments about what David said, and then if you are up for it, I will ask you about how you see form follows function, how you can apply form follows function to any area, any general area. Okay, so I want to comment on 3 things that David talked about. He started by talking about beauty. Okay, that is a very crucial point here. Form follows function is not a very dry, it's not a dry principle. Okay, the way in which in the hands of Louis Sullivan, okay, it is very beautiful, because what he's saying is that we human beings are a creature of spirit, emotions, intellect, physical body. We have a social nature. All of that is us. And when he says form follows function, the form has to speak to all of that. The Alhambra example that David gave was a perfect example. You're not just solving some one problem. You have to keep your eye on the human being and everything the human being needs. All the requirements, all the functions. The same thing showed up when he talked about the design of his school. What was the ruling principle? It's that the social interaction is important. And how do you design? In order to invite people to have social interaction. So don't build a school just because the schools are built some way. Go ahead and look and saying, what should a school be doing? What should the children be doing? And how do you structure the school so that that becomes natural? Whether it's a school, a community space, The same principle applies. It's by keeping your eye on the function and evaluating all forms with respect to that, that you do that. The third point that he made was about materials. As materials evolved, what becomes possible also evolves. Forms, even when you design it really, really well, you're designing them not, you're using the materials that you have. If you're working with wood, you can do certain things. If you're working with brick, you can do certain things. When you move to reinforced concrete, you can do something else. You also have to understand, like Louis Sullivan's, one of his masterpieces is this essay on tall building artistically considered. And there he starts by saying, let's see what the problem of the city is. Everybody wants to be in one place. If everybody wants to be in one place, what can you do? You have to go up. That's the only way. You can have so many people in one space. So it's just an incredible point. So thank you, David. So it's just beautiful. Rupali, are you able to speak?
Yes, I can. I'm just going to, yeah, I can. So I would say that when I think of form follows function, I of course start with architecture because that's where I first came across it, was in my architecture training. And when you look at buildings that are made for a certain purpose, they certainly would follow the purpose for that building. And if it is not, then you can actually feel within a building that, all right, the proportions are not right, or it doesn't serve the purpose for it was made. I think the examples that you gave about the materials, I would like to say, for example, when reinforced concrete was made possible for thin shells, ferrocrete, you could actually have the buildings that were made of thin shells, and with the possibility of the material, the plasticity of concrete, you could come up with different forms which didn't exist before. So I'll actually go with the materials. And in terms of education, if you look at Montessori schools, the classrooms are designed for the needs of the child. And so the function is, okay, what does a child need? And if we go from understanding the child and look then from the child, within the child to outward expression, then you can see that the freedom the child needs or the materials the child needs can be designed in the classroom, whereas it doesn't have to have the traditional classroom environment. So I know you spoke about education and you spoke about the building materials, and I piggybacked on those 2 points.
Wonderful. Go ahead.
Yeah, in terms of form follows function in an organization, I think, again, if we look at some of the management techniques, it again is, if there is a function that a certain meeting format supports, then it's useful. Otherwise, it takes away time from people than serve them. So those are the ways I see form follows function.
Wonderful. I want to just build on one point that Rupali made about Montessori, because I think that illustrates the point beautifully. Okay. Imagine a traditional classroom. You've seen many pictures of these little kids sitting at their desks. Okay. In a row after row, teacher right there in front with a blackboard. And look at a Montessori classroom. What's the difference? Montessori held that a child is an independent being capable of learning. And the goal of the school is to create an environment in which the child can learn and develop all their faculties. And the role of the teacher is to be watchful observers, to provide whatever is needed, just like you would water a plant when it needs, and let the plant grow, let the child grow. So the Montessori classroom Montessori system spends a lot of time creating materials with which the child can interact. They are scaled. So depending on their capability, they can go for larger blocks or smaller blocks as they develop their physical acuity. And it systematically studies all the senses and all the ways in which the human faculties develop at that age between 3 to 6, and creates materials and lets the child choose the materials. It's incredible. Also, kids of multiple ages, 3 different years are in the same classroom. So there is a teaching going on, mentoring going on between kids. So they learn good human interaction. And all of that is done by simply starting with the principle of what a child is and what it needs, and building forms accordingly. Whereas now look at what is the implicit principle behind a traditional classroom. It is holding that the knowledge is already there, which has to be transmitted. These forms have to be transmitted. The child is passive, can't move. Again, not moving for a child, that's really not what a child is. So you're putting them in this artificial position of sitting all day, trying to absorb ideas, not actually figuring out how these ideas come to be and what they are and how to use it, but just passively absorb them. It's a very different view of what a child is and what a human being is. So, so that's my observation on Montessori. So folks, I mean, I'll just make one comment here, and that is, this form and functions go together. It's like the function is the action of what you're trying to do, what you're trying to accomplish, and forms is the structure through which you are accomplishing it. So there is this loop going on between form and function. In order to build beautifully, you have to build. You have to keep building. So it's not. It's the same point about center and periphery that we're making. It's not center versus periphery. It is center driving the periphery and periphery supporting the center. So it's acting from the center. So it's an idea of functionated forms. Forms, functions creating their own forms, and forms supporting the functions that allow them to go to the next level. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to, I've created 3 rooms. They're going to be led by Evanique, Joe, and Maritza. Please discuss these ideas for about 20 minutes, after which collect all the questions that you have and come back and ask all the questions. I'll collect all the questions, and then we will try to answer all of them. I'm starting the breakout rooms now. Welcome back, folks. Welcome back. All right, so it's time for questions. Go ahead and ask any question that you have about form follows function. Our format is to collect all the questions, and then I'll organize them and then pose them one by one. And anybody who wants to answer them can answer them. So we're going to start with Maritza, Kevin, and Rupali. Maritza.
How do we reimagine or revisit a function when the originally intended function is no longer valid? And how do we extrapolate that outside of just architecture?
Okay, so when original function is no longer active, how do we rework the new function? Okay. Thank you. Next up is going to be Kevin, Rupali, A2, and Angela, and Joe. Kevin.
Thank you. My question, reverse order form of the form follow function, how the form shapes the function. For example, social media, original form, communication, better connection. Now they create a new function, business, personal usage to create a new function and form. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. How does form shape function? Excellent question. Next up is Rupali. Rupali, go ahead.
My question is piggybacking on what Maritza said. How do you recognize when the form is no longer serving the function? What are the indications? Because one of the things I notice is people so desperately try to fit the form because it had worked so well in the past, but they're not recognizing that the function is no longer served. And change is hard. So how do you recognize that the form is no longer serving the function?
Wonderful, excellent question. So I'll combine that with Maritza's question. Okay, next up is Andrea. Andrea, go ahead. Would you like to read out your question?
Yeah, so it's actually kind of tangentially related to Maritza's. So if something has no function, does it continue to deserve to have a form? And sometimes, Joe was talking about like people holding on to things. So sometimes we don't really understand what the function is of a form. That like sometimes the function of this is a bad example, but there was a woman that in this one class that I taught, and she basically like entered data in a form that could have been loaded from a file. But the function for her was not that the data was there. The function was for her was that it kept her busy. And so that was definitely something that she wanted to hold on to. It kept her busy, it kept her comfortable, which is a different function than what someone thought the original function was.
Got it. Very good. I'll figure out a way. It's a great question. I'll figure out a way of formulating it. Next up is Joe. Joe, go ahead.
If you can figure out how to form this question, I'll be impressed. It's
that previous question or the one that you're about to give me?
Mine.
Okay.
It's like, so essentially, how does form follows function relate to aesthetic beauty?
Okay. That's actually very well formed.
Is it like it's pretty?
Okay. How does it relate to beauty? Okay. Next up is DLJ. Do you have it in a form of a question? No statements. You can ask any question you want.
Oh, sorry. I was just making note of that's my answer to one of the previous questions.
Okay.
So
No,
I forget them if I don't write them down.
Next up is Jeff. Jeff, what's your question?
So I wonder if the form, rather than being a solid thing, like a building, could also be a living thing, say a partnership between people to do something, a business, a marriage, whatever. And if that, what are the implications of that?
Sure.
For creating a form that is the fulfillment of a function that is alive and that is always responding to the environment and is changing even within itself as the people change and the relationships change.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Excellent question. Excellent question. All right, folks. So we have got excellent questions here. Let's see. I'm going to spend some time just reiterating the questions, and then we will go ahead and figure out which order to take them in. Okay. So the first question, I'm going to combine Rupali's question with Maritza's question. How do you recognize when the form is no longer serving the function? How do you recognize when the original function has stopped being relevant and that you need to reconceptualize the function? Okay, so what is this a question about? This is a question about when, there is a function. So on your paper, you can put function on one side, left side, and then form on the other side, okay? So the first question is that there was a function that actually created a form. Now the function, that function is changed so that the form is no longer following it. So what is that, how do you handle that? The next two questions, actually, I'm going to combine Kevin's question with Andrea's question. How does form shape function? Because form actually allows only certain kind of function to go through, and makes other kinds of functions difficult. So that's kind of a way of looking at the implicit function that is there within the form. And Andrea's question also is about that, when something apparently doesn't have function at all, but then when you actually see people using it, you're saying, oh, that's what they're trying to do with it. So the actual function is quite different from the supposed function. So there is kind of the idea of implicit function. So you look at the form and say, what kind of function would lead to that? Okay, so that is, so this is like, so start with the form and say, okay, what kind of function is implied by it? What will it lead to? Okay, we'll take the question about beauty at the end. And in terms of Jeff's question, the living forms, very much all of Louis Sullivan's is about living forms. So it's very apparent in all living things. So, so the thing that we're talking about is not just material things that are made, but your habits, your emotions, your ways of doing things. So all of that. So all these questions we will deal with respect to that. So first, let's start with the question from Rupali and Maritza. Then we will go to the questions from Kevin and Andrea. And then we will go from there to the living forms, and then we'll go to the beauty. All right, so the folks, now the question on the table is, how do you know when a form no longer serves the function that it is meant to serve? How do you know that the original function has changed, that you need to rework the function? If you'd like to answer that, go ahead and type an exclamation mark. So now it's time to answer questions. So go ahead and type exclamation mark. So it's going to be Evanique, Brian, and Maritza. Evanique.
Yeah, I think when you know it's time to stop using the form is when you wonder why you're doing something. Like if you're doing something and you're questioning why you're doing it, then maybe it's time to take a look and see if the form is really useful anymore. And I think you can see that in jobs. When I was with my old company, we had a contract system, right? It was called doc management. And it worked when it worked. And then we found out that the form, which was doc management, which was intended to organize contracts, really didn't work the way we needed it to, because anybody could put anything in there. And we were like, why are we doing this? This is more confusing. So then we had to go to a new form, which was imagery. And so many people pushed back on it. And so then we had to question again, why are we doing this? But what we found at the end was that the new form, imagery, was better than the old form, because now we had centralized and now we could control it better. And we knew that the contract that we had in imagery was the correct contract. So I think when you see it not working, you're questioning why you're using it, that's when you have to reevaluate the form to see if it's still doing what it was meant to do or what its function was. And if not, you have to work on finding something new. But it's hard because sometimes you can't just drop the form. Sometimes you have to kind of like, work it out in a sense. Like you have to phase it out. And, because if you just drop the form, then you have nothing sometimes. So you just have to kind of know. You have to question it. I don't think it's just, you just drop the form. I think you question it and then you find a way to phase the form out and make a new form. That way it can still fit the function. But I think on the flip side too, you have to look at the function to see sometimes, is this really what you still want? Because sometimes the problem might be the function isn't doing what you needed. The function isn't what you want anymore. You're moving forward. So maybe creating a new function as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Ebonique. Next up is Brian. Brian, I didn't call upon you in the beginning, but if you want to say something more about what you get from this principle, you're welcome to say that.
No, I'd just like to comment on this
Please do.
question. And so what happens when the function changes? And I don't, Ebony gave a great talk on that. I had to laugh because I've worked in organizations and I've seen that happen with programs and facilities. It's like, oh my, what do you do? But the thing the point that the answer I would give is that the change in function is almost inevitable in my experience. So it's a reformation of the reforming of the forms, repurposing of the forms is also inevitable. And that should be taken into account when creating the form.
Wonderful.
That's really all I have.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Next up is Maritza, followed by Joe. Maritza.
Well, Shrikant, this is Comprehensivist Wednesdays. So my response is going to be a little bit cheeky. I'm going to quote Russell Akoff. So a problem is to reality what an atom is to a table. What you experience are tables, not atoms. The funny thing is, when I read this from Russell Akoff, it wasn't as impactful as hearing it stated in The Design Way by Harold Nelson and Eric Stolterson, the idea of the whole versus the parts. So what I was thinking, and I'm throwing a wrinkle here in this question, even though I'm the one who asked it, what if the problem is not that the functionality is no longer any good, but the initial functionality was too limiting, or perhaps not as well conceived or perceived as we thought? Maybe we were looking at too small of a whole and not a big enough portion of the whole. Because, for example, Brian had talked about this beautiful bank with this beautiful separate section that was and it had the perfect purpose, this separate section. Now that purpose no longer exists. What if by getting so down to minutia and making that one little area so specific to a very tiny function, well, then we failed in the overall design of being true to the function because it was too small focused. So maybe the answer here is that, well, first of all, by design, that's my to be cheeky comment.
Mhm.
And then the second piece is if you find that there existed a function that was perfect yesterday, and today it seems superfluous, the problem most likely lies in the failure to look at a big enough whole. You didn't realize you were looking at a part because you thought your part was the whole. And well, then we just regrouped and we jumped back into that iteration. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Next up is Joe, followed by David. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that there's all kinds of signals. I mean, it depends on what type of problem you're talking about, or even what the form was actually servicing to begin with. So I think that it becomes evident when you kind of recognize that things around you have changed and that the form is no longer useful. And I think that that's kind of where I'm trying to think about it in the terms of, let's just take the example of a type of job in a corporation, say, and this gets back to what Maritza was essentially saying, was the parts and the whole, right? The types of jobs, certain types of jobs may change and go away, and they become they're no longer serving a purpose, and you kind of they've actually stopped you from changing or innovating or things along those lines. Essentially, that I think that I want to say, in a way, the world lets you know that if your function is no longer if there is no need for what you're doing anymore, and it's nature. At the end of the day, I really think it's just nature itself, human nature, or actually nature itself, that allows you to recognize whether your form is no longer necessary or not necessary anymore. We could look at this in terms of environmentalism, or we can look at this in terms of a lot of different areas, but something around you tells you. I want to say it's the market, but it's not. All right, so.
Thank you. Next up is David. David, you need to unmute.
Can you restate the question, Shrikant?
The question is,
Just to remind me.
yes, the question is, how do you know when a form is no longer serving its originally intended function and that it needs to be recast, redone, or the function needs to be re-identified?
Yes, yes. And the question makes me think of a song I heard a long time ago, and there was a line in there that the questions are the answers, sir. The lady soothes the lion's fur. I forget the rest of the song. And I think if the function has collapsed, it's too late. What's important is the form. If we're in a corporate environment, what's important is the harmony that exists among the people, their cooperation, their definition of what the function is. And if the function is fixed, okay, the function is dead. What does not change is dead. If I'm working with a dead function, I will realize that sooner or later. It's up to the team, the people who are working, to develop that perception, that amount of expertise and anticipation, such that the function never collapses, such that the function is always changing. The function is a living object. It doesn't stay in one place. It moves around the room. It goes this way and that way. And the people who are working with the function call it the problem or the function. or the object or the goal have to adjust as the goal will shift.
Wonderful.
And that's what I want to do. Well,
Thank you.
that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Next up is Ambika. Ambika, you need to unmute.
Very good idea. If I didn't, neither the form nor the function would be effective. So for me, as a creative person, I discovered that the two literally sort of work together. You know, one thing affects the other. And then, for example, if I'm writing a poem and I want to rewrite it, the whole form can change because I want the effect to be more pronounced or more evocative or mysterious. So the two kind of work together. And the same thing with changing your own patterns in your life, for example. Having, you know, completely given up something, it's taken me some months to find a new rhythm because I was so much caught in the old rhythm that has to completely break. So to be more effective, to be more principled, to be more who you wish to be, that authenticity has to come back in a new weave. So I really see this as a weave. So, and if something isn't working, your body tells you, your mind tells you. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambika. Okay, I'm going to take a very extreme view here because I've been reading Gita. I've been reading Bhagavad Gita. The function is your spirit. It is your Atma. It is the core of your being. That's the function. And in Bhagavad Gita, the forms are very dynamic. You know, they come and go. They're continuously changing. And your whole practice is to remain focused on the function and let the forms change. When you're interacting with another person, you're doing namaste. What you're saying is that the God in me greets the God in you. The function in me wants to interact with the function in you. And all the forms that are there in between are all variables. You know, whether the person is high or low, young or old, whether they're from this caste or that caste, whether they are doing this or that, what disagreements, agreements we have, all of that is forms. The function is this kind of interaction. So this view is an extreme functionalist view, which regards forms as being tremendously variable. So just want to put that on the table. Next up is Rupali.
So I'm repeating what Rohit is saying. He's not joining, but what one of the things he can't stay away from this conversation. So he's saying,
I'm glad.
So what he was saying is that form and function are evolutionary. And if you look at nature, when things are evolving, whether it is new species or a forest that's growing or a river that's flowing, that nature evolves and they go hand in hand. The form and the function go hand in hand. If the function or the form become obsolete, then the course changes, and then, you know, one of them is obsolete or both of them are obsolete, and you have to look at it again.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rohit. And thank you for transcribing, Rupali. All right, next question. This is actually a very interesting question. Okay, I'm going to take, this is both Kevin's question and Andrea's question. Many times you see forms and you say, why are they there? But they are there. And the thing is that nothing can actually exist unless it is supported by something. You need action to support everything. So those are actually implicitly are being supported by some functions. And you kind of have to dig and see what functions are supported by it. There are forms which look very weird that are producing all kinds of effects. As Kevin was saying, okay, the form is actually making functions flow a certain way. So the question is about forms which look very odd and seem to be destructive, seem to be pointless, but still exist. What is going on with such forms? What do you think about such forms? Why are they there? And how do they work? Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to answer that. We're going to start with Evanik, followed by Mike and Andrea. Evanik.
I think the forums are there for comfort. Like, people are just comfortable with doing what they do every day. And a lot of people do not like change. So they don't even want to look at it. They just know, I do this thing every day, and they don't even look. And it's a shame, because when you get comfortable like that, you don't notice anything until things start to break down, or, new companies come in, new things come in and they question, and then you get defensive about it. And when you get defensive about it and you're an institution, you fight for that form, but you don't really know why you're fighting for that form, except that this form makes you comfortable. I don't know how many times I've heard, this just works, right? If it's not broke, don't fix it, and things of that nature. Or, why are we changing this now? I don't understand. And the thing is that they are not even looking to understand. They're just looking to defend the form, and they will defend it because it's comfortable. They don't want to change. They don't want to go through the process. I think when you go through like a form change, inevitably the function is affected, changed, or expanded somehow, some way. So when people are looking to change the form, people fight and they get defensive about it. And sometimes it's because it's something they created, and sometimes it like taking the time to do the new thing is like a death and rebirth. And you got to kind of kill the old function and then bring in a new function, and the labor pains with that, and the rebirth and the pain that ultimately comes with that, using a new system, learning a new way of thinking, learning something new, period, that they have to do, can be painful. And so they don't want to. So I think that's why people stick with their forms, even though they don't know why, or they don't understand that that's what they're doing, even, because it's just what they know. And now it's something completely different.
Wonderful. I just want to follow up on the metaphor of rebirth. I think that's a beautiful metaphor, because what happens is that rebirth by itself, by its nature, is painful. Because you have to give up something, you have to rework something. There is a new thing coming into being, but that's the price of creating a new function. And if you're not willing to pay the price, you're not going to have the rejuvenation. It's going to be a slow death. It will be comfortable, but it's a slow death. In order to just keep going, you have to have this kind of a rebirth. And that does take the willingness to be uncomfortable, willingness to give up, your habits, your old habits. Next up is Mike A, Andrea, Joe, and Maritza. Mike A.
Was there a name for the phenomena? I always thought it was something called Chesterton's fence. Maybe somebody here would know what I'm mentioning. It was the idea that if you come across a form, you need to be careful before you remove it, before finding out what its original function was. If you were developing property or something, and the fence, I think that was the idea, is there, and you take the fence down without knowing I'm pretty sure it was either Chesterton's wall or fence. I don't know if anybody else has heard that, but there's a bit of a warning in that process.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Andrea.
Wow, I really like what Mike said. I guess I keep thinking about how this relates to government, because the function is sort of optimization of resources, but at some point the form changes its function and its function becomes to maintain itself. And like Rupali was saying, and like Evanique was saying, it is evolutionary, but evolutionary is not necessarily easy and not pleasant. It's often rather explosive and painful. So, one of Mike kind of offered a caution, which I think was really a good thing to think about. But also, I mean, I don't know if there's a way that we can, I don't know if there's a way that we can plan to be able to handle constant change so that it's not so explosive, because we like comfort, right? And actually, I think we create comfort if it doesn't exist. So I don't know, a lot to think about there.
Yeah, no, this is interesting. Juxtaposition of what you're saying, what Mike is saying. Many times there are reasons why things are the way they are. At the same time, many times there aren't. You look at a traditional society, there are so many things in there. And if you take the approach of saying, and I cannot resist, but to quote one of the Seinfeld lines, which is one of my favorite Seinfeld lines. There is this thing where Seinfeld and George are talking about Newman, and George says, maybe there is more to Newman than we think. And Jerry says, no, there is less. So sometimes that is the case too. So both sides can be true. Next up is Joe, followed by Maritza.
Could you repeat the question after that answer? I mean, that was really good.
Thank you. So the question is that when you look at a bad form, what is the reason why so many bad forms continue to be there? What supports them? What enables them to continue?
I mean, I think that this goes back to people hanging on to forms. And I think this goes back, to sometimes power structures and the way the structures are actually, and in a way it's working against nature. It's working against the evolutionary process. So you may keep I don't know, and I'm not trying to debate the ideas of environmental science, but let's just say coal was something that you don't want any longer, but there are a lot of people that are dependent on it, meaning for jobs. And so that they are then kind of resisting the evolutionary process. So it's essentially people are hanging on to the form and not following the function. And I think that that's why bad forms, quote unquote, exist. There's also the important part as well is to understand what that form is doing. What are the implications? What are the alternatives to that form? But the reason why is that because people hang on to forms.
Wonderful. Maybe we'll talk more, after Maritza has a chance to talk about this. We'll ask about what this mechanism of holding on to the forms. Let's talk more about that. Maritza.
So I might have been prepared to accidentally address that aspect, Recast.
Please.
So it works nicely for me. I was looking at it from, if I'm thinking of, so you use the term Atma for function, and I had said life essence. If I looked at it from that perspective, what came to mind for me was something that Sullivan spoke about on the idea of being awake and of inattention. because he tells us that inattention, not indifference, is the root of the trouble. And also in the same thing, he says, so many people are half dead. If you receive not, you cannot give. And to receive of life, you must be awake to it. Why does this come to mind when you're talking about bad forms? For me, the way that I make that leap from that aspect of something he was telling us is that I think a lot of forms that may now be considered bad, if we're looking at it from the concept of function as our life essence, it's because we are evading or we're drifting. We're not sitting up. We're not looking with attention. We're not being intentional. And as such, we find ourselves with this form that is less optimal, or even, if we want to stay away from bad or good, it's less optimal, or it's not truly serving the function in the manner in which we may perceive it to be doing. And, it's also, it addresses the idea of, Andrea talked a little bit about, she was thinking government could bring rise to that, but that makes me think then of culture versus the individual. If we have individual neglect, it may lead to cultural forms that are not serving the function of the community, because too many individuals are just not, they're not awake, they're not engaged. And so that would be, to me, the reason why we end up with these bad forms and why we hold on to them. It's not even that we're holding on to them. We're just not giving it enough attention to address the fact that it may or may not be appropriate anymore. And at least that's my perspective on it.
Thank you. So now let's look at squarely at this point where you've kind of touched upon it, the point about why is it that people hold on to bad forms? Because it's not like if you push them, if you ask them, they will say, oh no, this is not really good, but they still do it. Why? So I'll invite everybody to answer, but one thing that I see is that, like, for example, when you look at Louis Sullivan's work, right? And when you look at him talking about the ideal situation, it's when you are creative, when you are full of love, of saying, I want to do this. This is a precious life I have. I want to do the best I can. This is a precious moment. I want to do the best I can. So it's out of love that you're saying, I want to make the most of this. And you're trying to look deep inside you, and you're trying to express it as fully as possible, and doing that relentlessly. And then in that process, you keep on transforming whatever you need to transform. The opposite motivation is that of fear, of saying, look, I have something, I better hold on to it, otherwise I'll lose it. So the fear of loss, immediately you're trying to hold on to things, you're holding on to your habits, you're holding on to the stuff, you're holding on to processes, because so it's a motivation of love versus motivation by fear. That's one of the things that I see underlying this, but I'm going to open it up. So why is it that people hold on to forms? Why is it, one of the ways we have said is that people want comfort. So what is the motivation behind wanting comfort as the primary thing in life? So just anything that you want to say about that, Joe?
I mean, you basically, I think answered the question. I mean, it's essentially, it's fear. I mean, people are unwilling to confront their shadows many times, for the reason that, they're afraid. And I think that is why somebody's going to hang on to the form. But just think about it, even in fear of death, what that causes you to hang on to, and how that prevents you from actually living. So when you start hanging on to these forms, it's purely fear, and an unwillingness to change. And then that's where the opposite of that is a very good example that you already gave, was with love. And so this idea that you're kind of embracing things, embracing life, as opposed to resisting it. And I think it's just a matter of our unwillingness to change, and our needs are not our needs, but our that we want to satisfy our own desires and not the desires, not the desire. Well, we want to satisfy our own desires in an immediate form, not in a very well thought out form.
I really like that distinction between kind of immediate versus kind of deeper. I think that goes on to, it's the same point about kind of periphery and center, because like when you're saying center, you're saying, I'm going to focus on things that I think are the most important. And that's what I will do. And I'll pay whatever the price I have to pay in the short run in order to do that. The opposite thing of saying, okay, I want the periphery to be fine for now. That's saying that, look, I'm going to lose anyway, so I better hold on to whatever I have. So very well put. Thank you. Next up is Maritza, followed by Evanique. Maritza.
I wanted to bring up here the idea of, the constant push and pull that we all have with order versus chaos, and the idea that perhaps this desire to grab onto that which is comfortable is it's fear, as you pointed upon, but it's like, that fear of the unknown. Chaos is scary to people, and they may not be willing to embark upon that journey because it's the unknown. This one may be flawed, but it's the one they know, so they'd rather remain there because they're not willing to take on the courage to move down the path that is the unknown path. That would be my thinking.
Excellent. So I want to elaborate on this point about chaos and order, because I think that's a brilliant point. If you look at kind of function and form, when you say function creates its own form, what function is doing is that it is reordering. It is creating order anew as per the function. So, and the form is the order that was being created by the function. So it is the result of the past function operating. Now, when somebody is holding on to the form, what they are saying is that I don't want to take the active effort of reordering, because reordering means that I'm going to encounter the chaos which is around the order that was there. I don't want to do that. I want to just stick with the order that was already achieved and hope and ignore all the chaos, because the chaos is there and the world keeps changing and the chaos is there. So it's a desire to refuse to reorder. And the function, focus on function, is saying, I will keep reordering as necessary. So it's also a statement of confidence versus non-confidence. So a person who is focused on the function is saying, I will reorder. I can reorder and I will reorder. Whereas a person who is holding on to forms is saying, I cannot reorder. So my only hope is to hold on to this that I cannot create. Go ahead.
One really quick thing, because you were talking about you're using the word I. It made me think again of, the Sullivan had mentioned that the voice of the I will is faint in someone who might be opposed to chaos, and that thought came up there.
Wonderful, thank you. Next up is Evanique.
Yeah, so one of the things I was thinking about, and Marissa touched on it, is the fear of the unknown. I think that's the biggest thing why, because I was thinking fear, but like, what are people fearing, right? When you were talking about fear versus love. And I was like, but what do people fear? people fear the unknown. And people also fear what they imagine in their head to happen. And a lot of times what we imagine in our head is happening is not really ever going to happen. Like 99% of our thoughts, I think, or some percentage like that, doesn't ever come true, right? We just think these thoughts in our head and we think, oh, this is going to happen. And then we realize that it never comes true, or we have it completely wrong because they're just thoughts. So I think that's part of it. And I think the part too is there's a vulnerability when you embrace a new form and you embrace a new function. And part of that vulnerability is when you're changing is that you're putting yourself out there with no guard, no wall, nothing. You're just kind of putting your idea out there, or you're putting forth this new form, and you are making yourself vulnerable to criticism. And I think a book I love is Daring Greatly by Brene Brown. And this is the quote that I love. And it's from The Man in the Arena. It's Teddy Roosevelt's speech. And I'll just read this part because I think it's key. It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to a man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives who strives valiantly, who errs, and who comes up short again and again. Because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least he failed while daring greatly. And I love that quote because I think it fits to this. Like a lot of people are afraid of being that person in the arena and stripping themselves bare for critics. But the one thing I think that quote makes you realize is that once you stop listening to those critics, whether you fail or whether you succeed, you still did it while daring greatly. And I think that's the thing. It's like people, when they fail, when they hold on to the forms, is because they're afraid of failing and they're afraid of messing up, and then they're afraid of the critics, and they're thinking about what people are thinking of them. It's like the center and the periphery. The periphery, you're thinking of what people are thinking of me, and then the center, you're daring greatly. And it doesn't matter what the outcome is, you did it.
Wow. Now there is one point that I'm getting, which is completely new to me. I was not expecting this. So let me elaborate, because this is a result of the fact that we've been looking at Gita and the Bible. And what I'm suddenly seeing, this is I have not seen before, is that this principle is, and this is also explains why many people do not understand this form and function in modern day, is that the function is essentially a spiritual. It's the same thing as the love in your heart that Jesus talks about, or Atma that Gita talks about. Let me explain. It's a combination of several things, which are all quite foreign in the modern analytical philosophy. What it is saying is that you have this spirit in you. You have will, you have spirit in you, you have a core of your being. That's number one. Second is that there is a universal nature of things. You can call it existence, you can call it God, you can call it Brahma, you can call it nature. Okay, all of it is equivalent. And it is your commitment to that, which is what is really the core that you're doing. And that's universal. And everything, and that's the function. So like this is the function in Gita, this is the function. So in Gita, it is said that you're trying to know yourself, your own nature, your own Atma, which is the same as Brahma, which is you're trying to know existence, and you are in love with that. And that's what you're focused on. And everything else is manifestations of this. And you can deal with the manifestations with this core in mind. The same, same vision, it's analogous to the vision that is there in the Bible, where you're saying that there is this love in your heart, love for God. I want to give you one specific example of what it means. Like, for example, to give a very dramatic, real example of what it means regarding fear and not fear. What happens is that if you have that, like when you say namaste, you're saying God in me greets the God in the other person, right? When you're saying that, you are able to interface with the other person, no matter how unfamiliar they are to you or how different they are from you. There is a universal commonality, and you are willing to take the effort to navigate that. The opposite of that is saying this person is of my tribe and this person is not. That is, you're focused on the immediate surrounding that you have and your familiarity, your habits, your current culture, in order to limit what you can do. So there is a component in the function of universality. And so that's what I see. It's a very large point, but I'm going to go to Andrea next. But then if you want to comment on it, whether you see that there is a commonality between this idea of function at its deepest level in Louis Sullivan and the notion in Gita or the Bible. So Andrea, go ahead.
This is kind of like really far off from what you were talking about, but it is kind of related in a way. So I'm in a meetup group here in Tucson where we were talking a lot about automation. And we were talking about, what would our function be when we're not just trying to survive? And I think, you're kind of suggesting, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're kind of suggesting that our function becomes more about some spiritual aspect and, like improving our interface with other beings on the planet, as opposed to just, I gotta perform these functions so I can feed my family or, so I can keep myself alive. But, it's kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs where, your function is pretty much to survive until a lot of the aspects of survival start being taken care of for you. And then your function has to evolve into something else for you to feel like there's a reason to continue to survive. And I think that's a struggle, like the easier it gets for all of us to survive without a lot of effort, it changes what you think your function is.
Thank you, Andrea. So folks, what do you think about this point about, the point that I made about the commonality between the function, the concept of function, and what we are reading in the Bible or Gita? Any thoughts about that? We'll start with Evanik and Joe. Evanik?
I think when you're talking about the function and the Gita, I think the function is, to get closer to who you are, right?
Yes.
And the form is the way in which you do that. And I think it's Gita, it's works, knowledge,
and love.
I'm forgetting.
Love, which is bhakti.
And love. So it's works, knowledge, and love, right? And so all those are used to find out who you are. But the function is in order to find out who you are, you have to recognize the function in other people to know who they are. And if you interact with them in that way, like they're getting to know who they are and you're getting to know who you are, you kind of get to the core of that, right? Of who you are by interacting with the other people. And I think that's the function. And I think the form is, loving people, right? Wishwar did a great example of that. I think it was Friday, where I had asked him a question about loving people who kind of, for lack of a better word, take advantage of you, whatever, or who are not that great to you. And he was like, it's not about them necessarily, it's about you and how you're treating them. And that was a hard lesson. But he was right, but it was a hard lesson because I could treat someone that treated me badly the same way, but maybe that shows who I am in a sense. And if I don't like it, I can change the function of that, right? So I think that's the way it works. And I think the same thing is in the Bible, is that you treat people with the respect that you want to be treated with and the love that you want to be treated with. And even if they're taking advantage of it, it doesn't affect the way you treat them. Even if you decide that you are not going to, maybe they're not good to have in your life. Maybe you have to look at their function in your life and say, maybe they're not good for me, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to treat them badly. I'm just, going to, distance myself and still treat them humanely, I guess is the way to put it. To treat them, and when they're treating you bad, recognizing that they're not recognizing their core. And they're not recognizing the God in them, but that's on them. That has nothing to do with you. And you don't have to like associate with them, but you do treat them with a certain dignity for your own sake, not for them. It's more for you, because what I learned through studying Christianity and studying the Bible is that when you treat people the way you think they deserve to be treated, it changes who you are. And if you keep doing that, it'll change the person you are into the person that you don't want to be. And you might reflect that person, and you might reflect who they are rather than who you want to be. So I think the function is key, and like making sure that you're not changing the function, if that makes sense.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Next up is Joe, Brian, and David. Joe.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think actually Avanique really captured what it really well when it came to the Bhagavad Gita. Essentially, the four yogas. When you're looking at the Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Jnana Yoga, and Raja.
Raja, yeah.
Yeah, Raja Yoga. Those are the pathways. Those are the forms that you're following in order to find your center and to get to know yourself better.
Wonderful.
And then so I think that captures that briefly, without going into detail with all those yogas I mean, love, knowledge, we just touched upon, to action. When it comes to Bible, I mean, I think there's the spiritual aspect of it that we can talk about. And then there's the other part about it, that the actual practical aspect of it, where the institutions that are being challenged, and I had mentioned this before, the institutions themselves that are being challenged by Christ, essentially, they're no longer serving their functions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sorry to interrupt. Let me just say one thing, but it's the same point of saying, if you look at the entire New Testament, it's saying internalize the functions, just focus on the functions. These external rituals that you have were actually meant to support these internal functions, and they are going away from that. So go back to that. And then what is being taught is that love, which is going to be the foundation for the church or for a community based on that. Go ahead.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's the rituals themselves that people are focused on versus the actual actions that are being taken. And that, yeah, no, I mean, so that's essentially, I think you actually captured it much better than I did. So, but yeah, it applies. It's a very good way of analyzing both of those works in particular, and even the Tao Te Ching as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Brian, David, and Douglas. Brian.
So I think the question was, is that at the core is the, is there a difference, or what are the differences and similarities between the function for Sullivan and the core in these other wisdom traditions? And I would say briefly, there is no difference. I think in the core, they are the same. I think the issues, there's been a lot of talk in the session today about functions changing, and that's just I would say that's fine. I don't mind that language, but it's manifestations of the function are changing over time, just as manifestations of the core are different in all these wisdom traditions. So I really think it's getting at the same thing. And if we take David's, the example of David's school, which he gave nicely the form and function example there, the school in Philadelphia, Roberto Clemente, it was the core, the core within the architects, speaking to the core within the students. And sometimes, I said manifestations of functions. One manifestation of the core of these students is the typical traditional need for education. And they saw that part of the core, that manifestation, and they went beyond and saw beyond that partial manifestation and looked further into the core and saw more of the core, and were able to address that in the form of the school they came up with. So I think a lot of the talk about, and I've used it too, the functions change. I think it's the manifestations of the functions, and the talk about, there's been talk too about misunderstanding the function. And I think that's also a case of where you mistake the manifestation of the function for the function itself, for that core itself. So I don't know. That's probably more.
Brian, that was brilliant point. Absolutely agree. I mean, the place where, the wisdom tradition that handles it really well or names it perfectly is Tao. Function is the Tao. It's the Tao in you. And there are 10,000 things. And you can very easily mistake the 10,000 things, focus on the 10,000 things as opposed to Tao. And Tao is what it is, and it is eternal. And it's only the 10,000 things that are many. So it's kind of going back to the eternal. And Louis Sullivan's thought is exactly that way. He's saying, listen to life, listen to nature, act accordingly, act according to that. He's drawing inspiration from that. That's exactly like the Taoist. He's also looking at the spirit of man. He's saying that is there within you. And that is a constant, unchanging reference point for all his work. So there is that constancy in those functions. And there are manifestations depending on how many people are interacting with one another. The kind of interaction, the format of the meeting will change. But each of it, the nature of individual remains the same. The nature of interaction between individuals remain the same. It's just scaled differently, so the forms are different. So beautiful point. Thank you, Brian. I really appreciate that. Next up is David.
Yes, I'm confused. When we say form and function, when we say form, is that a verb or a noun? When we say function, are we using a verb or a noun? Because I listened to this discussion and my mind keeps flipping back and forth between these different meanings, and sometimes function means form and form means function, and I have to adjust myself. For example, in the world of Sullivan, what I believe, and please correct me if you can help me with this, I believe when he says form, I think that's a verb or something that I associate with action. And when he says function, I identify that with something that's fixed, like a building that has an elevator, you know. And form would be the desire to gather up a community of people into this beehive of workers.
David, isn't it exactly the opposite? Isn't the building the form and desire to gather people the function in Louis Sullivan?
Well, I think in the spiritual world, my function in this world is, for example, loving. That would be the most fundamental. But I think in the language of Sullivan, that comes in as form, and the manifestation becomes the function, or the doing of it becomes the function. See how I'm mixed up on
I
verbs
don't
and
think
nouns?
so. I think you're, I would say that, he would clearly hold building to be the form and the desire to gather people together, the function. That's how he deals with it throughout his entire corpus, through all his work.
Yes, and I agree with you. My function is to pull them all together.
Yes.
The form comes out of loving cooperation, or my love for the cooperation among people, that when I see people cooperating, it makes me happy. Okay. And for me, that's the form, and it becomes manifest. Is it my function to manifest, or my function to wish people cooperate? See how confused I am?
No. Okay. The thing is that it's kind of I like the way you're thinking, because you're focused on the functions and you're talking about how, how they are expressed themselves. Let me give a chance for Rupali to address this. Rupali, go ahead.
Well, so form follows function. To me, the verb is follows. That's the action. And form and function are both nouns. They are both objects. So if we look at it, that form and function are either concrete or ideas, things that you can touch, feel, smell, sense with your senses, or you can think of as ideas. And then the relationship between the two is the action and the verb that's happening. So to your point, David, I think that the form and function are both nouns, and the action is actually in the word follows. So it's how they manifest, how the forms manifest is the verb.
Thank you. That brings a lot of clarity. That's a good way to look at it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. David, by the way, I just loved your description of your school. Just everything that you said was just incredible. So thank you so much. So folks, I have some incredible meetups coming up this weekend. Two of my favorite people are coming back. On on Saturday, Mark Stallman will be back. And he's agreed to talk about the topic that I have been wanting him to talk about. And he's going to be talking about how to be an autodidact. Okay, he's one of the most amazing autodidacts I know. And I'm going to have a conversation with him. And I invite you to come and ask him, think of, because all of you, autodidacts are what most people here are. But he does it at a level much, much higher than most people I know, definitely including myself. So come with whatever ideas you have, whatever questions you have. I'm going to format it so that there's plenty of time for people to ask questions. Okay, but try to formulate your questions sharply, and we want to go through as many questions as possible. He's going to be talking a little bit about the history of autodidacts. He's going to be talking all kinds of stuff. I still have to work out with him. And just this morning, we decided to come up with the idea, and I immediately announced it. He's also going to be back doing a full series of 8-part series, starting end of February. So that's one thing. Second, another of my favorite people, Yasuhiko Kimura, is also going to be back this weekend at 11 o'clock. And that topic is so incredible. He's going to be talking about the new spirituality for the future. So his point is that it's not enough to go back to the old spirituality. At the same time, it's not enough to just ignore the old spirituality. What you need to do is to know the old spirituality, integrate it into our modern lives, update it, give up things, give up parts of it which don't fit the modern life, and integrate it with everything else, great things that we have known. And how do you do that? It's basically the theme of integrating the East and the West. So it's very, very deep. And he's also agreed to come on every month, starting this Sunday. So each month we'll be developing this theme of new spirituality or integration of East and West, mostly new spirituality, I would say. That's what we want to do. So again, come, ask whatever questions. It's going to be, I'm going to have interview with both these people to put all the core thoughts on the table, and then there will be plenty of time for questions. And they, as you know, that they are very, very good at handling questions. They answer questions behind the questions that you were asking. So those are the two. We also have the Fountainhead at 2 o'clock on Saturday. We also have Dostoevsky at 5 p.m. on Sunday. And we also have Dao De Jing. We have Jason and Amon coming back to go through the entire new translation that they're doing at our meetup on Dao De Jing. So it's an incredible weekend. Of course, tomorrow we are going through Gospel of John. We are on chapter 9. We are going to be seeing the difference between blindness and sight, and how some people who think they're blind can actually see, and vice versa. It depends on whether you're focused on the periphery and the core. The way in which Gita puts it is that the people who are focused on the core, they actually think that whatever is night for the other people is day for them. And people who are focused on the periphery, it is the other way around. And so that is what this is the Bible version of that, of seeing and blindness. So, and I'm going to be going through Aquinas' commentary on that, which is incredible. So very, very deep principle tomorrow. And then on Friday, we are really hitting our stride with the Bhagavad Gita meetups. We are going to wrap up chapter 5 and begin the chapter on Dhyana Yoga, which is chapter on meditation, on concentration. That's chapter 6. And Yogeshwar and I are going to, going through this Naneshwar commentary, which is incredible. And Yogeshwar is going to do, he's going to be going through the Sanskrit itself. Also, after this, Yogeshwar is going to do a presentation on 4 different commentaries on Gita. So these are the 4 commentaries in Sanskrit, and he's going to compare various of these commentaries. These are by Shankara and I think Ramanujanchari, and there's like 4 of the most, it's like equivalent of Aquinas, Augustine, and everything. And he's going to give an overview of how do you approach Gita through all these commentaries, how do you use them in your thinking, and how do they actually complement each other. So incredible stuff coming up. So hope to see you soon. And David, welcome to the meetups. Please join the 52 Living Ideas meetup, because that's where all these meetups are. Okay. If you have not already joined it, please go ahead, search for 52 Living Ideas and go ahead and join. All right. Thank you very much, folks. Thank you for a great meetup. Bye, everybody. Good night.